Good morning. I'd like to say a few things on where we're at in the independence movement and all that's happened since 2007, frankly, right up till the present date and Nicola's present state of play as defined by her various statements and the papers that have been published. We are at an impasse with the UK government. There is no political party of the Union in UK who is committed to a Scottish independence referendum legally done in what has, I believe, wrongly called the gold standard. It's an unfortunate metaphor of the 2014 election, but we know what we mean when we say that. That will not work now. There is total opposition to it. The opposition is expressed in one of two ways. Sort of sinister way of saying, well, we don't rule it out forever, but now is not the time. It's quite clear that that's a long grass kick. Now will never be the time for convinced unionists and the unionist parties. It's a delaying tactic, one that served the British Empire very well throughout its heyday, until it started losing colonies and whole countries en masse. The other is to simply say, you've had your referendum. A decision was taken by the people back in 2014, and that's it, forever, or a generation. Now, much nonsense has been talked about what was said in once in a generation. I'm not going to go over it all here. I've done it endlessly. I'm online and in print and on video of saying what the limitations were of what was said about once in a generation. It's patently nonsense. The radical changes that have taken place since 2014, the betrayal of the promises that won that election for unionism, have all been altered by the radical events since then, notably Brexit. Where are we at? I think Nicola and her cabinet, and at least her rational advisors, understand that we are not going to be granted a referendum by any unionist politician or any unionist leader visible on the horizon at the moment. It's not going to happen. And what can Nicola do in the face of that? Well, there's always a big stark choice. If the monolithic organisation of the constitution that you're trying to escape from is denying you that escape, then you have a choice of actually unilaterally declaring independence, seizing the levers of power from a position ideally of government, which we have in Scotland at the moment. We have the SNP Green independence committed government in Scotland, seizing the levers of independence and confronting all that goes with that. It's a very, very radical step, a very dangerous step, one that any rational Democrat would be anxious to avoid if practicable, if not pushed to the brink. The other is to simply go on in a state of gradualism, trying to build the will of the people as expressed at the ballot box and as sampled by opinion polls. That we do not govern based on opinion polls. If that was the case, there would have been some extraordinary governments put into power at extraordinary points in time. Opinion polls are simply a finger wet, an informed finger, and held up to the wind to see where the people think they're at right at the moment. What determines what people think in our present system of government is the national elections known as the general election for the whole of UK, which is a first past the post, non-proportional representation, simple majority election. It has never in any shape or form been dependent on the majority of votes cast, nor in any real sense has the devolved administration's been involved in it. Proportional representation takes some account of the total number of votes cast. It still comes down to constituencies in allocating representatives and representative democracy, which is significantly under the control of the parties, not of the people. It's the will of the people expressed through a number of filters which limit, frankly, the people's power. Now, I would have said over a month ago that anybody who suggested to the SNP that they should determine any action of theirs based on the majority of votes cast, it would be laughable and a dangerous and idiotic thing for the SNP to do. So in that respect, I'm going to agree with a man I'm going to criticise later, a journalist, once respected Scottish journalist, certainly by me, Ian McWhirter. Nicola's route map, if you like, to independence statement, what I understood it to be, and this is only my understanding, was that Nicola had accepted realistically that the legal route she and her advisers and the Scottish government preferred to independence, again, the gold standard of an agreed independence referendum agreed with Westminster and with Unionists. She has recognised that that is dead. However, she must follow through certain legal requirements, if for no other reason than to emphasise, if we pursue all the routes that we perceive to be the legal routes of the expression of the will of the Scottish people, and they're frustrated, then we have to look at other options. Now, another option always hanging out there was, and it used to be openly expressed by unionists well within my mid-range lifetime, that all the SNP had to do at any point to gain independence was to send a majority of SNP members of Parliament to Westminster. It was as simple as that. And then you say, there it is, we now want to commence negotiations for independence, and you can't deny that. We did that. We did that with massive landslide vote in 2015. Unfortunately, we did it just after having lost a referendum. Now, Nicola could have seized that at that point, but I agree it would have been a very radical step to grasp it at that point, and she didn't. There would be little point in going over all that happened since that landslide election in 2015. All the false starts, everything that happened in relation to Brexit, a huge event, huge stone thrown into the pool, the ripples of which are now threatening to inundate our economy. And Nicola's various false starts of calling referendums, backing off, acquiring the unfortunate term, the Grand Old Duchess of Independence, constantly marching our troops to the top of the hill and down again. But their electoral success has continued. So in the only democratic way available to us outside of the Westminster Parliament, where we'd already massively expressed the will of the Scottish people by electing an independence-committed government, we had our devolved government, and again, notably at the last Holyrood election in 2021, clearly stated that if you vote for an independence party, the SNP or the Greens at this election, you're voting for a party committed to a referendum determining the will of the Scottish people and achieving our independence. There could be no doubt and no amount of shimmy-shammying about by unionists to try and say people were voting for Nicola for other reasons, cut any ice whatsoever. The election spoke for itself. I believe Nicola has now accepted that she is not going to get the legal referendum that she would like, as a lawyer and as a naturally cautious politician. Nicola is not a risk taker, but she will be forced to take risks. The problem for all risk-averse people, industry leaders or politicians, is sooner or later events pushes them to a decision, at which point they may be forced to take an even greater risk than they would have done had they acted earlier. That's where we're at. But she's going to go through all the legal requirements to get a legally approved referendum in Scotland. Remember what the referendum is. It's simply putting to the Scottish people the constitutional choice, yet again, that was put to them in 2014 and that they rejected, but which has been overtaken by massive events, which means we can't possibly judge the will of the Scottish people in the context of how they voted in 2014, leaving aside that they were deliberately and systematically lied to about what would happen if they rejected independence and voted no. They were betrayed. They were betrayed by the vows and the promises of massive devolution and etc. So none of that came to pass, and Brexit was the crushing blow. 62% of the Scottish electorate voted to remain, and yet we were overwhelmed by the national vote. In itself, that's a massive argument for independence. So I think Nicola has accepted that. Now she then has to answer the question, which the Yes movement have been asking by the day, by the minute, by the tweet, and what certainly she and her advisors and her MSPs are asking themselves. If the UK government consistently refuses to grant us another referendum, what are we going to do? Now the options are pretty clear. You either call what would be described by unionists as a wildcat referendum. In other words, you call a referendum in flat defiance of the UK's refusal to approve one. Now there's a number of risks with that, not least of which is the risk, some might argue the certainty, of the boycott of that referendum. But boycotting a vote does not grant you any rights in the outcome of that vote. If people abstain from voting in a UK parliamentary election, they may have shown their disdain for the option they're being presented, but it won't cut any mustard when it comes to electing the government. The democratic vote will still prevail. But that's the situation. Nicola has now called a referendum and named a month in which it will take place. Next year, just over a year away from now. And she's going to do that. She almost certainly believes, I believe, any rational observer and listener and viewer of what unionist politicians and leaders-to-be are saying is that we will not be granted a Section 30 order, we will not be granted a referendum, and therefore that referendum, if called, would be called on the fiat and the governing mandate of the SNP government at Holyrood in defiance of Westminster. Now that in itself would be a kind of UDI. It would be a step towards autonomy, which is, if you won't do it the way we would like to do it, by consensus and by legal routes accepted by the whole of the UK, then you force us back to our own democracy. And after all, the territory we are arguing for is Scotland, and the nation we are arguing to return to full sovereign status as an independent state is Scotland, and its parliament is Holyrood, and its government is the SNP Green government. We will hold that referendum. That would be an act of defiance. It would be a kind of Boston Tea Party event, in fact far more significant than that. Now, Nicola realises all the difficulties of that. So she sees another option, and that is, what is the next democratic election that is coming up and that is scheduled and will happen? It's a UK general election. Let's go back to the much older argument, which I alluded to earlier, that if a majority of SNP or Independence Committed, means SNP and Green political parties, will return to Westminster in the general election, that is proof positive of the will of the Scottish people and immediately creates the right to enter and compel, demand that the UK enter into negotiations. Now that is not determining, as some have suggested, notably in McWhirter, dictating to the English government what the outcome of the general election should be in England. It's not. It's saying recognise the implications of that general election. It is not saying to the electorate, we demand that you ignore the UK general election, and if you're a unionist, you're forced to see it through our prism. It says none of these things. It simply says, in that general election, we will condense, compress, and focus our presentation to the electorate. If you vote for the SNP Green coalition, you are voting for a party committed to an independence referendum, and in the longer term committed to independence, but committed to an independence referendum and determining the will of the people. In no sense are we trying to change the UK constitution. In no sense are we trying to pull the wool over the Scottish electorate's eyes. Unfortunately, the SNP allowed this question of the majority of the vote to creep back in. And in doing that, they haven't made a mistake that is irremediable by any means, as McWhirter has suggested. But they sure as hell haven't helped the game in that. And the confusion created by John Swinney, who got it right, making the same assumption I made, and frankly I believe any yes voter who's paying any bloody attention would have made, that we did not mean the majority of the vote, we meant the majority of MPs returned under the electoral system. So in recanting in that, or appearing to recanting, it's still not quite clear where Nicola stands on this, regardless of what we say. If that becomes the defined de facto truth, the factoid becomes the fact simply because of endless recognition. Nicola could find herself at the next UK general election having every Scottish MP returned an independence committed MP, but because they didn't have the majority of votes cast, it would be invalid. So I don't know where that's going, but we have to get it clarified pretty damn quick. And please, independent supporters, I'm one voter, one tiny voice, and tiny fragment of the percentage of the Scottish electorate. But I do try and see things clearly, as clearly as I can, and offer my perspective. Do try and get a handle on this and forget the superficials. Try and understand the absolute essence of where we're at here, because it matters, and it matters vitally. Sorry to go on so long, but I've said my piece. Who can do more? Now you have to say yours. Bye.